Hey guys, Matt Kleinsteiber here. I am just making this video to introduce you to what I think is the most important chapter of my new textbook. I'm doing it for two reasons. One is for that reason that it's kind of a fundamental chapter. Two, it's a little bit complicated, so I want to put this video out there in case people are having trouble dealing with this chapter. This is from Matthew's Guide to Digital SAT Writing, just published, really proud of it. And this is actually the first kind of grammar lesson. And what this covers is finite and non-finite verbs. Now, I don't expect you to know these terms, finite or non-finite, but by the end of today's lesson, you should be able to understand what those mean, okay? The reason I kind of begin with this lesson as my first grammar lesson is this really lays the foundation for later grammar topics. And so it's something you're really going to want to know. Historically, this wasn't directly tested on the SAT, but with the shift over to the digital SAT, the DSAT, it's now being directly tested, and you'll see how. So, our goals for today, we're going to figure out what this means, how to identify finite verbs, identify non-finite verbs, and we're going to look for, one thing about a finite verb is that we have to have them in order to have a sentence. And so if we don't have a finite verb, we have a fragment. We'll learn how to spot and identify those. Let's just start with a really simple question. This is actually the most straightforward type of question that you would see on the DSAT, okay? I'll read it and I'll give you guys a little bit of time to try to come up with the answer. You should hopefully be able to do it. So, from Beethoven's Revolutionary Symphony Number 3 to Bernstein's dynamic West Side Story, symphonic music has undergone significant evolution. According to musicologist Laura Turnbridge, this evolution blank changes in societal attitudes and expectations, as well as advances in musical technology and theory. So we need to fill in that blank with one of these options. And it should be, hopefully be pretty simple. The answer here is going to be A, reflex, okay? Now, hopefully you kind of intuitively knew that that was the answer. But what I like to ask students is, why is it the answer? Okay, so think a little bit about why is it reflex? Why is it reflex? And I've heard a lot of different opinions about why this is from students, and it's always fascinating to me to hear what my students have to say. I've heard, all sorts of things. I mean, one popular answer is it just sounds right, okay, which doesn't really work if we're trying to think about what the grammatical reason behind something is. Other students tell me stuff like, "Oh, well, it's the only one that's in the present tense," which is getting a little bit closer to the truth. Let's see exactly why that's the case. Go to the next page here. So all of those answer choices are verbs. Zoom out a bit here, actually. So all of these answer choices are verbs, right? But only A belongs to a special type of verb category called a finite verb. Okay, so A is the only finite option. And we have to have a finite verb in order to have a sentence. In other words, these others all create fragments, okay? To reflect this evolution to reflect changes, fragment, right? That's not a sentence. This evolution reflects changes just by itself as a sentence. Reflecting, again, this kind of breaks that sentence. If we had a simple sentence like I walk to school, you kind of know that that's a sentence, or she walks to school. She too walked to school is not, right? That too breaks the sentence. She walking to school is not a sentence either, right? Or she having walked to school. Again, these would kind of break that sentence. So these verb forms, and they're called non-finite verb forms, by the way, they all ruin a sentence, right? They cannot be the main, I shouldn't say they ruin it, but they cannot be the main verb in a sentence, right? So B, C, and D all create fragments. If any of that's unclear, it'll hopefully become clearer as we proceed. So if we want to decide if something's a finite verb or not, in other words, if it could serve as the main verb in a sentence, there are a couple of things that we can look for. So one thing is finite verbs can change form based on subject. They don't always change form, but they often do. For example, we say, light waves travel, but light travels, right? So we say, they walk, but she walks. So notice that that S gets added on the end. And that changed the fact that when we moved from something that was plural to something that was singular in this case, they travel to it travels, right? That the fact that we add s there shows us that this verb is definitely finite in this context, right? So travel and travels are finite here, right? They are working as the main verb of the sentence, and they are changing based on that subject. Subject, it really, if we want to think about an easy way, the subject is typically the first word in the sentence, right? Especially in a basic sentence. So light waves or light. Now, most verbs are regular like that, where we're just kind of adding that S onto the end when we're changing from that plural to singular subject, right? Just like we saw. So there we're adding that S. Show, right? They show, he shows. They draw, she draws, right? So we're adding that S. Other verbs change more dramatically. They're called irregular verbs. And you may want to just keep a note. I know I'm dropping a lot of different grammar terms on you in this lesson. Other lessons are a little bit more direct. Again, one of the reasons that I chose to kind of review this. So when we're thinking about irregular verbs, we're thinking about verbs that change pretty dramatically as the subject changes. So kangaroos, plural, right? They are unable to walk backward. True story, by the way, true fact. The emu is unable to walk backward, right? So as we move from this plural subject kangaroos to the singular subject the emu, the verb has to shift. We can't say the emu are unable, right? Or kangaroos is unable. That wouldn't make sense. And so are and is are actually always finite. And they're some of the most common finite verbs. In other words, they can always work as the main verb in a sentence. Okay. So these are always finite. So just remember that are and is are always finite. And there are other verbs that fall into this kind of like irregular pattern as well, right? That kind of change in strange ways. And we don't just add s. We'll talk more about that later. We're going to do a quick little exercise here. So this is called Is It Finite? We're going to see sentences and we're going to try to pick out what the finite verb is or the main, it's really acting as the main verb in all these sentences. The sentences are in the present tense. If that's confusing you, don't worry about it. We'll cover it later. Here's an example. So in this sentence, many nutritionists now recommend a plant-free diet or a plant-based diet rather, sorry, not only for health benefits, but also as a strategy to mitigate climate change by reducing carbon footprints. We are looking for our finite verb. The answer is going to be recommend. How do we know that for sure? Well, one strategy that often works is we know that the finite verb would change based on subject. So the tip that I have for you guys is if we're not sure, what if we change this subject and instead of saying many nutritionists, we said my nutritionist? Okay. Notice that we can't say my nutritionist now recommend, right? That doesn't sound right. We have to add S on. So my nutritionist now recommends a plant-based diet. Oh, that sounds right. Because when the subject changed from that plural nutritionist with that S at the end, right, it's plural, to the singular nutritionist, um, the verb changed too, right? So a finite verb changes in that situation. Other stuff wouldn't change. And so because it changes, we know it's finite. So we can apply that strategy as we move through some of these questions below. So I'll just zoom in a little bit. So sperm whales form clans with complex social structures. What's our finite verb there? It's going to be form. Okay. How do I know for sure? What if I said a sperm whale, right? Then I'd have to say a sperm whale forms. I'd have to change this verb. And that lets me know that the finite verb is form. Okay. That is the main verb in the sentence, and it does change form based on subject. What about in my next sentence? Inuit communities are tracking melting ice patterns in Greenland using traditional knowledge and modern technology. So I'll give you guys 10 seconds to answer before I say. Here, okay, I'm going to give some hints. First of all, I said this word is always finite. Okay, it is always finite. It's one of the most common finite verbs. And I'm going to say a lot of students like to tell me something like using, okay, or tracking. I'm going to say it's not using or tracking. Why not? Well, ing verbs cannot be finite verbs, right? I walking to school or she walking to school, that's not a sentence, right? So they don't change form based on the subject. In fact, the finite verb here is are. And you can double check that by saying, okay, what if I said an Inuit community? Okay, and I kind of changed this. So I made this singular. An Inuit community is tracking. So because are would have to shift to is, that proves that it's finite, right? Let's come to 3. Google's quantum processor Sycamore solves equations hundreds of thousands of times faster than the world's most advanced supercomputers. Take 10 or 15 seconds. Okay, so one thing that you can do here is let's imagine that Google had many quantum processors. We'd have to say those processors solve, right? And so that lets me know that solves is my finite verb. It is working as the main verb of the sentence. Um, some people may think that advanced is a verb here, and advanced can be a verb in some contexts. We'll talk about that later, but here it's just working as a modifier or an adjective describing the type of supercomputer. So we typically think of a verb as like performing an action. That's one big category of verbs. Here it's not really doing that, right? Solving is doing that. Form could be thought of as an action. Can also indicate a state of being is one way of describing a verb. So are does that in example 2. Advanced is not really performing an action or describing a state of being. So that's another way of kind of thinking, it's really working as an adjective like impressive supercomputers, advanced supercomputers. We'll circle back around to that though. Let's come to 4. So here, Chickasaw astronaut John Harrington, the first enrolled member of a Native American tribe to travel to space, advocates for STEM education among Indigenous youth. Give you guys 15 seconds. This is a little bit tricky. I would say, just like we said, advanced wasn't the verb in 3, enrolled isn't the verb here. It's working again as an adjective describing member. What kind of member? An enrolled member. So it's giving additional detail. I'm going to say that our finite verb can't come in what we'll later learn is called an interruption. So these are kind of like descriptive phrases that often appear between a subject like John Harrington and a verb like advocates. They could be surrounded by dashes, parentheses, or commas. Okay, so this is just kind of like giving us additional detail about who John Harrington is, and it's not central to the sentence's meaning. Anyway, if we said the Chickasaw astronauts, we'd have to say advocate, right? So here it's actually going to be advocates as our finite verb. Um, Again, because if I change that subject to one that's plural instead of an astronaut, John Harrington, if I said astronauts, I'd have to say they advocate. So that tells me that advocates is a finite verb. One of the giveaways that we see in some of these is they're ending in S, right? Let's go to our next question. Thanks to advances in 3D printing, researchers have developed bioink made from human cells, allowing for tissues and organs to be bioprinted. I'll give you guys 15 seconds. Okay, I'm going to say we can kind of ignore this opening element thanks to advances in 3D printing. I'm going to say my subject is researchers. Okay, so that's a kind of big giveaway. Um, and so if I said a researcher, I would have to say has developed, right? And so my finite verb is have. Okay, that is what's going to change if I move that subject from one that is plural to one that is singular. So a researcher has developed, researchers have developed. So because have would change to has, this is my finite verb. Made is again kind of like a trap. It's working almost like a modifier describing that bioink. So what kind of bioink? Bioink that's made from human cells, right? So made is not working as a finite verb in this context. It can in other contexts. That's tricky and we'll get into it later. Um, Six, take 15 seconds there. I'll tell you this is one of the most common finite verbs, and it's always a finite verb. Let's imagine that Michigan had two Potawatomi tribes, right? And then we would say the Potawatomi tribes are. Is my finite verb? It's always finite, right? Um, ing words, as we'll discuss later, cannot be finite verbs. Like I said earlier, I walking to school isn't a sentence. Um, Neither can verbs after the word to, like to help. I to walk to school. No, right? Same thing here. So I hope nobody got confused by some of these other types of verbs that are non-finite throughout the sentence. We'll come back around to those. So if you're not sure about what I'm talking about, don't worry. Coming to seven, our last one. I'll just give 15 seconds here. And this is a very common finite verb. Okay, again, we've got that researcher popping up. We've just got one researcher here. But what if I said the researchers? I would have to say have, right? So the finite verb here is going to be has, because if it were researchers plural, this would move to have. Um, this opening stuff, like using, we know that that ing couldn't be a finite verb. Um, and this is just kind of like an opening phrase. It doesn't have like the key sentence elements that we need, like that subject and verb. You could actually eliminate it and the sentence would still make pretty good sense. Okay. So I hope that clears everything up, that this went well. Let me know in the comments if you have any questions about why something wasn't finite or how I solved any of these. All right, let's go on to our second finite verb rule. So our first one was that it can change according to subject. It usually also is going to change based on tense, okay? Tense means that, you may have heard this before when we're talking about things that have happened in the past, for example, like last month, in 2009. Those can suggest that we're using the past tense. Something like today or currently can suggest that we need to use the present tense. Let's just look at some examples. Today, polar bears face habitat loss. 50 years ago, polar bears faced no such challenges. Okay, when we moved to the past tense, we added that ed ending, right? Which is very common. That's the regular pattern. Today I walked to school. Yesterday I walked to school. Okay, or currently I walk to school. Those are kind of awkward examples. You'll see why in my tense lesson, but for now, we'll just say, okay, it works. You can kind of see that ed ending popping onto the end of verbs. Now, that shows us, by the way, that these are both finite. The fact that it does shift when we move to the past tense or we move to the present tense, face and faced are both finite because of that reason. Um, right? Now, sometimes we see more dramatic examples, so those are kind of the regular example. Just like with our irregular forms, we can see that in tense as well. So in the past, the Vjosa River was threatened. Today, many wild rivers are threatened. Because was changes to are, when we move from the past to the present, we know that both of these are finite. In fact, was, are, we already said, is always finite. So is was, and so is were, by the way. Okay, so that's another test you can use to see if something is finite. Is it shifting as we shift into the past tense or the present tense? Now, as I kind of indicated before, this can be contextual, okay? So this is where things get tricky. If you need to pause the video, come back to it after you've let this sink in, but I think you could be good to go. So, in this example up here, right? Threatened is not finite. Was and are finite. Okay. Threatened is not finite in this context. Um, and there are other times that threatened is not finite either. So it's not changing, right? Was is going to are. Threatened isn't changing. Let's look at another example. Conservationists want to protect California's threatened ecosystems. Just like we saw in that exercise, this is working as an adjective describing ecosystems. It's not a finite verb. Want is our finite verb, and we would say, you know, conservationists want to, a conservationist wants to, right? So that's changing. That conservationist wants to protect California's threatened ecosystem. Threatened is never changing in this context, right? Again, this is not a finite verb. It is a non-finite modifier. It's not the main verb in the sentence. It's working more like an adjective. So don't let that ed ending confuse you. These, when it ends in ed, it's going to depend on context. Okay. So don't, and by the way, threaten could be finite in some contexts, right? Today, non-native eucalyptus trees threaten California's ecosystem, right? In the past, such trees threaten California's delicate ecosystem. Here, threatened is the main verb in the sentence. It changes, right, as we move from the past to the present. So, yeah, hopefully that makes sense. And we'll come back around to that a little bit later, but those ed verbs, it does depend on context. You can't just see an ed word and say, oh, it's finite or it's non-finite. You have to really think about what it's doing. Is it working as a modifier? Well, then it's not the finite verb in the sentence, not the main verb in the sentence. One thing that can help us, and I recognize again that I'm throwing a lot of jargon at you, so that's the reason that I made this video, but auxiliary verbs, okay? Auxiliary verbs are also called helping verbs, right? And the thing about verbs is they often appear in groups or phrases. So we've already I've already shown you a lot of examples like this, but I just want to point this out directly and make it clear. So the James Webb Telescope is capturing images from 13.5 billion years ago. This is a verb phrase, right? Her research was referenced in the 2022 Supreme Court case West Virginia versus EPA. The oldest known hominin skeleton has been studied extensively since its 1994 discovery. We've got an auxiliary verb, is, was, has, and we've got these non-finite verbs like capturing, referenced, and been and studied, okay? Our auxiliary verb is finite, okay? In other words, the first verb in that verb phrase is the finite verb. It's the only one that's going to change as that sentence changes, right? If I say the telescopes, I'm going to say are capturing. Capturing isn't changing, only is, right? Uh the re uh let's see, her papers were referenced. Her research papers, right? If I change that to plural, it would be were referenced. The skeletons have been studied. Been studied isn't changing, referenced isn't changing, capturing isn't changing, right? So they are not finite. Now, we have one group of verb that is a little bit weird, and you're going to have to kind of memorize this separately. Those are our modal auxiliary verbs, okay? They're verbs like can, could, may, might, should, would, will, and shall. Okay, these are our modal auxiliary verbs. Now, these do not change form based on subject, making them a little bit tricky. They are finite, but they do not change form based on subject. We say they can and he can. Okay. Can doesn't change. We don't add an S or do anything else. He could, they could. She may, they may, right? Again, it doesn't change, but it is still finite. You just have to remember these as being finite, okay? Um, one thing to think about is, obviously because they're finite, they can be the main verb in a sentence. Can you help me? Yeah, I can, right? I can is a full sentence, and that can kind of prove to you that these are finite. Could she do that? Yeah, she could, right? She could is actually a full sentence. And maybe that's helpful for you in showing you that this is um, a sentence has to have a verb. So it has to have a finite verb. So in those sentences, can and could is working as that main verb. They do sometimes change based on tense, right? We don't say last year I can climb to the top of that hill. Last year I could climb to the top of that hill. Okay. So please just memorize these, know that they are finite verbs, even though they don't change based on subject like our other finite verbs do for the most part. We're going to do an exercise here. What we're going to do is we're going to look at the verb after the sentence and decide what form of that verb goes into the blank. So we're going to use context clues like, you know, tense, um, like dates in the past to see if we need any tense here. All right. I'm just going to grab a. So I'm going to give you guys 15 seconds to try to fill this first question in. You're just moving possess into that blank and changing it if you need to. So this should be the mimic octopus possesses, right? We have to add that es ending because it's one. It possesses. What if we say octopuses? Okay. And by the way, there are many different plural forms of octopus. So don't let that throw you off. Could octopi is fine, octopuses is fine, even octopods is fine. This will be octopuses possess. They possess, right? Right, and you can go ahead and move on to C as I try to write that in here. 18th century composer Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. Some students here say possesses. No, not possesses. 18th century lets us know that unfortunately he's gone, right? He's passed away. And so he is no longer alive. So therefore he possessed, right? That 18th century is the clue that lets us know that we need to move into the past tense. All right. So why have we done that little exercise? Well, we're going to ask ourselves, did possess change based on a changing subject or tense in this context? Yes, it did, right? It changed based on the subject changing from one that's singular to one that's plural. It changed as we move from the present tense to the past tense. Is it finite? Yes. Okay, that's the definition of finite, changing based on a changing subject or tense. Okay, that is one way we can think about whether or not something is finite. If not, what are the finite verbs? Well, we don't have to do this, right? It is finite. Let's come to our next example. So, researchers have blank. Some species of ants use a specialized form of agriculture, cultivating fungi within their colonies for food. Um, we're using a form of discover. Just take 10 seconds here. Don't overthink it. Just say what sounds natural. That is discovered. Okay. Similarly, for the next one, we'll just say 10 seconds there. American marine biologist Sylvia Earle has blank critical information about marine ecosystem and deep sea exploration. That is also going to be discovered rather, right? Same thing. And what about N2C? By 2010, researchers had already blank over 1,000 new species in the Mekong River. That is also going to be discovered, right? Discovered, discovered, discovered. No change. Did discover change? No, it did not. Okay. Is it finite? No, it is not. Okay. So, what then is finite? Because we have to have a finite verb, right? What are the finite verbs in this context? Take a look at those sentences. I'll just give you 15 seconds to think it through. They are going to be have, right? That first auxiliary verb in the verb phrase, has and had. Okay. Those are our finite verbs um, that would change, right? Based on subject or tense. I hope that makes sense. Why? If it's unclear, let me know in the comments. Now, here things are going to get a little bit tricky, but this is an important example. So hopefully you're staying aware of what's going on. Today, landscape architects are blank outdoor spaces such as parks, gardens, and recreational areas, combining elements of aesthetics, functionality, and environmental sustainability. And our word is design. Take 10 seconds. That is going to be designing. Um, yeah, hopefully you could just intuitively know that that's what it should be. Some people like to say they are designed, but that doesn't really make sense. A person can't be designed. Um, let's go to 3B. Currently, American company SpaceX is blank reusable rockets like the Falcon 9 and Falcon Heavy to reduce the cost of launching payloads into orbit. Again, our word is design. 10 seconds. So this is just going to be designing again. Currently, American company SpaceX is designing reusable rockets. Let's come to 3C. ByteDance, owner of the social media platform TikTok, reportedly wants to blank its own semiconductors. That is going to be design. Okay. Just stick with my blue here, actually. And go ahead and move to 3D. Spanish inventor Narcís Monturiol wanted to blank the first air independent combustion engine driven submarine. Again, our word is design. Just going to clean up some of the other elements here as you guys are solving that. So again, that is going to be design, right? Just going to copy that over. All right, now we've got an interesting point or question. Did design change form based on a changing subject or changing tense in this context? Take your time while you're answering that and think carefully. Okay, a lot of people jump to conclusions as they see that question. Did it change based on a changing subject or a changing tense? You may not like the answer, but I would argue no, it didn't. It did change, but not for those reasons, right? So I'm going to say no. I'm going to say it changed, but it's not because, for example, landscape architects moved to American company SpaceX, right? It didn't change between these two. Didn't change between these two either. So I'm going to say no. And I'm going to say it's not finite in this context. Now I'm going to say, okay, what are the finite verbs then? I'll let you think about that, okay? We said before, by the way, that ing verbs could never be finite, like she walking to school is not finite. And we said to plus a verb, like she to walk to school, is not finite either, right? So that could have been a clue that designing and to design aren't really finite in this context. What are my finite verbs? Take 10 seconds. So in that first sentence, my finite verb is going to be are, which we said is always finite, right? In 3b, again, one that's always finite, it's going to be is. As we move to 3c, it's going to be wants, right? Bite Dance wants to design. Um, it wants, they want, right? Or Narcisse Monturiol, if we move to the past, wanted, right? So that is my finite verb. And design is not finite in this context. Cool. Well, I guess we'll wrap up the first part of the video here. I think I'm gonna maybe make a series. I don't want to overwhelm you guys with stuff, so we'll wrap this section up here and be sure to like, follow, subscribe, comment, and buy my book, Matthew's Guide to Digital SAT Writing, where you'll find this chapter and tons of other really useful SAT content. All right, see you next time.